See the marked peg? It's the middle peg on the end that's indented. That should be the first peg for this project. You may cast on and work either clockwise or counterclockwise, it does not matter, but start there. Set up the loom like this so that we're using all the pegs at one end and all but 4 of them, 2 on each side, at the other end. Normally this is not the way I would choose to set up, but for this project it's essential. This is the FG3 short loom with a total of 40 pegs. So by not using these 4 to start with, we'll be beginning on 36. Cast on with the double E-wrap around all 36, and let's get back together. If you don't know the double E-wrap, that's contained in another one of my KISS videos. With everything cast on, we begin working knit 2, purl 2, ribbing around, beginning with the second stitch of the 3 on the end, knit 2, purl 2, and we'll end up with purl 2. Do that for at least 2 inches. It may be as much as 3 or 4 according to your preference. Here is the trickiest part of this whole design, and it's not that big a deal. Loosen the nut, slide out the distance of 1 peg. There's the next pin over. We had this aligned with this pin and this pin in a straight line. Move out 1 pin so we'll be able to include the next peg in our work and tighten back up. Now we will work the increase by reaching down and picking up the loop from the stitch just below the one that's on the peg. Mine came off. I've got to reseat it. Now there's something on this previously empty peg that will function as a stitch. We need to do the same thing and fill the other peg. Reaching down, finding a loop. We normally refer to these as purl bumps, but since some of these are knits and some of these are purls, some of them are the loop from the top of a knit stitch, some of them are the loop from the top of a purl stitch. Okay, now we're set. That's an increase. Now we have knitted all of our ribbing rows. We're going to move on to stockinette and knit 2 complete circuits around and then increase again. So we won't be including these pegs. They are not yet part of the design, but we will be including these pegs. So we're up to 38. And I see I'm not quite straight here. There we go. 2 stockinette rounds have been completed. You can see them right there. See the difference? You can see it shifting from knitting and purling to all knitting. So we're going to repeat the operation and incorporate these last 2 pegs. Loosen, slide out, tighten. If you don't get it aligned perfectly now, it looks like I did, but it's easy for it not to be. It's okay. As soon as you finished your increase, you can realign it. Let's reach in. There's the top of the stitch from the row below. Stretch it over. And again, this one jumped off, but I can rescue it. Look down inside. There you go. You get a view. Reaching for that. Lift it up and settle it. 2 more plain stockinette rounds, starting with our usual first peg. This next round we're going to start knitting back and forth rather than round and round. So I will begin by knitting every stitch all the way around and stop here. It'll almost be just like the 4 previous rounds, but when I stop here, I'll be going back the other direction. So go ahead and knit around from peg 1 to peg 40. Okay, I'm around. The white stitch is stitch number 40. This was stitch number 1. Now we're going to go back the other way, slipping the first stitch of this round. So now the white stitch is on what will be peg number 1 for this round. Slipping it simply means in this instance we do not wrap or knit it. We're going to purl 4 and then knit around and purl the last, well, 4 of the last 5 and knit the very last one. 1, 2, 3, 4 purls. And now knit on around until we're 5 pegs from the end, purl 4 and knit 1. Here I am with these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches to go. So I'll start purling. We'll purl the first 4, 2, 3, 4, and knit the final stitch. See what I just did? Don't do that. I got a little bit of my yarn caught on the pin because I was having trouble reseating my purl stitch. It's in my case from working around the camera, but there are so many things that can cause it. It's something to keep an eye out for and lift any stitch that gets caught that way off the pin. Last stitch of this round, knit it. Now for several rows, we're going to repeat this every time we come the direction we just came, starting here and going around to here. It will be slip 1, purl 4, knit around, purl 4, knit 1. And what we are about to do is what we will do every time we go this direction, and it's the easy row. Slip 1 and knit the rest of the stitches around. Repeat those 2 rows until 16 rows in total have been worked that are open at the end. So we've been going back and forth. That includes the first row, which was slightly different from the others in one way. We knitted the first stitch. On most of these rows, whether knitting or purling, we're slipping the first stitch. An opening will form right here, a slit in the side of the work. And what we're effectively doing is knitting garter stitch at the edge of the work to make a band that encloses the thumb and hugs it tightly. Now, I'm going to knit 16 rows. I think for very many ladies that will work. But you've got a little bit of leeway. Those with long hands or muscular thumbs, and it really does vary quite a lot, may want a few more than 16 rows. Those with very petite hands may possibly want fewer. It isn't so much here about the girth of the whole hand. We're talking about this area, and both degree of plumpness in general and muscularity will affect this dimension. So what's happened is we've knitted a cuff that's intended to come 2 inches up to here. Then our increases will hit about here. And the opening is intended to cross this part of the hand. At this point, the rows for the thumb opening are finished. The last row knitted began with slip 1 over here, purl 4, knit all the way around, purl 4 beginning with this peg, 1, 2, 3, 4, and knit 1 on this peg. And our opening, let me try to turn it so you can see, has formed for the thumb. So we're done with knitting open rows, open-ended rows. It is time to decrease and start knitting in the round again. In order to do that, I'm going to move the stitch on each end peg of a side over one peg, making sure not to wrap around the pins. Let me explain more fully what I mean by that. If I had lifted this stitch off of this peg and gone straight across, I would have accidentally gotten knitting in front of the pin, which is not desirable. So I came around towards our side as we are looking at it of this pin. Now we can just loosen the nut, push in one peg width, tighten it back. There won't be any interruption in the knitting by decreasing in this manner. This stitch has just been knitted. We'll slip it this one time and knit every other stitch around, and then we'll decrease again. Of course, on the first row after a decrease, you have 2 stitches to knit off together, and that's it. That first round following the decrease is finished. Here's the last stitch of the round. Here's the stitch that was slipped to begin the round. No more slipping after this. We'll continue knitting in a circle, but we do want to decrease one more time. Same method. Loosen the nut. Well, I really should have moved over my stitches first, but it's not a problem. And then we'll be back to our original 36 pegs. Stitches moved, end comes in. With that round completed and back to the 36 stitches we started with, resume knitting and purling around. It could be knit 1, purl 1, but for this design I prefer knit 2, purl 2. So there's my knit 2. And we'll purl 2. And this can go on for as many rows as you need. It's going to vary quite a bit with the size and length of your hands, as well as personal taste. Let me put mine down. The thumb will end about here. Now, some people like their fingerless gloves just to the knuckle. And if on my hand, that's roughly an inch. That would be 8 rows. If you like them longer, or you have longer hands, you're going to want more rows. But it's quite easy to measure where you expect that opening to end and decide how many rows you want. And if you make a mistake, you can always leave yourself open to a correction by knitting the number you think you want. Let's say I want the minimum, I'm going to knit 8. Then if I remove the work onto waste yarn or a stitch holder, I can try it on. If I find out my poor little knuckles are still sticking out, I can knit a few more rows to cover them. If by chance I find out I've knitted too many and I can't move my fingers because they're enclosed down here, I can always unravel a few and bind off. Most of the time you're going to come very close with a measurement and an estimate. We're all done. Let's bind this off. You may really use any method that you like as long as it's tidy and it stretches well enough to allow you to put your hand in and out. I'm going to recommend the transfer bind off, which I'm showing now. Very quickly I'll describe it. One stitch goes to the next peg over, wrap that peg, knit it over, and repeat. Makes a nice neat edge. You'll want to visit my video index on my website, theanswerlady.com. I have an entire page indexed for kiss looms and another entire page for more traditional looms. And in the videos contained therein, a huge number of basic skills are covered in exhaustive detail. So if you're a new knitter, those may help you quite a lot. Here we are, all finished. Let's do a quick pattern review. Cast on 36 stitches in double E-wrap. Knit 16 or more rows of knit 2, purl 2 ribbing. Over the course of the next 4 rows, work stockinette rounds, increasing 2 stitches every other row by moving those ends out. That's the area where it grew. Knit 16 or more rows for the thumb opening, working as a flat panel, not in the round, slipping the first stitch of each row and alternately knitting 4 purl stitches after that at the edge with 4 knit stitches. So some rows are knit all the way around, perfectly simple, except for slipping the first row. Other rows are slip 1, purl 4, knit around until another purl 4, knit 1. Resume knitting in the round here, decreasing 2 stitches at the same end as we increased on every row for 2 rows. Return to knit 2, purl 2 ribbing, knit at least 8 rows, and bind off. These row counts fit my hand the way I hoped they would. If your hand is longer, you may want more rows in any one of the segments. If your hand is considerably slimmer, you may want to use 32 rather than 36 stitches. And if your hand is considerably bigger around, as could also happen, you might like to start with 40 and go to 44 stitches. For a larger version in circumference, you do need a few more pegs at your disposal, so you need some ends to go along with the sides I was using.